Cornell on July 5, 2017. Almost a year prior to this incident, a documented criminal street gang member belonging to the same gang as Mr. Cornell was shot and killed by 2 sheriff's deputies. Law enforcement received information the street gang planned to harm Vista Sheriff's deputies in retaliation, specifically to harm the deputy associated with this officer-involved shooting. There was even a threat to rape a family member of the particular deputy. Approximately 3 weeks before the incident involving Mr. Cornell, deputies were briefed that Cornell had an outstanding felony warrant. This briefing included the particular deputy sheriff involved in this officer-involved shooting. Mr. Cornell was suspected of involvement in 2 crimes, the murder of a 13-year-old boy and the attempted murder of a rival gang member. This information was also known by the particular deputy involved in this shooting. Deputies were made aware of Mr. Cornell's distinctive neck tattoos, were advised Cornell was known to carry firearms, and that Mr. Cornell was believed to be armed and dangerous. A week prior to the shooting, sheriff's deputies were briefed that Mr. Cornell had returned to Vista after having spent time out of the area and was considered armed and dangerous. Also prior to the shooting, the specific deputy involved in this incident saw several posts on Mr. Cornell's social media. One post called for fellow gang members to go from being watered down into action and to find him and join him. He had another post that indicated that his life was getting closer to an end, which told the deputy that he might be preparing for a suicide by cop. Another post said that he's apologizing to everyone that he has hurt before he leaves this world. On the day of the incident, a sheriff's deputy located a vehicle in an apartment complex that was associated with Mr. Cornell. Another deputy responded to the area to assist. Additional detectives arrived to survey the area. During the surveillance, one of the detectives broadcast over the radio that Mr. Cornell had run from another vehicle into a nearby apartment complex. The detective stated on the radio that he saw Mr. Cornell reach into his waistband and it appeared he may have a handgun. Another deputy broadcast that Mr. Cornell had jumped over a fence. One deputy went over the fence and down the embankment. A second sheriff's deputy followed behind. The first deputy then walked up at a dirt slope and into a yard with his firearm drawn. When he approached the house, he saw a man who later was determined to be a resident on his hands and knees who appeared to be in distress. He also saw a woman behind the man near a doorway. The deputy asked the man if he had seen anyone running around, and the man pointed in front of him. The deputy walked forward and up a small flight of stairs. As soon as the deputy reached the top of the stairs and the corner of a shed, he saw Mr. Cornell to his right. The deputy stated Mr. Cornell was crouching down behind a plastic children's pool, as if taking cover and hiding in a position to ambush him. The deputy saw Mr. Cornell holding something in his hands that appeared to be hard and covered with a t-shirt. The other deputy also saw Mr. Cornell holding something dark and wrapped around his right hand. He believed the object to be a gun. Both deputies gave Mr. Cornell commands which he did not comply with. One deputy saw Cornell quickly pull his hands from behind his back and brought them up, as if drawing a firearm. The deputy fired several rounds at Mr. Cornell. The second deputy ran up the stairs when he heard gunshots. This deputy did not know whether Mr. Cornell was shooting or whether his fellow deputy was shooting. Mr. Cornell was struck with bullets, rolled to his right on his stomach, with his hands concealed beneath him near his waistband. A deputy approached Cornell, and when he got closer, Cornell quickly turned his left shoulder towards the deputy. Fearing Cornell was going to pull a handgun out from underneath his body and shoot him, the deputy fired 2 more rounds. There were 2 civilians to witness parts of the shooting. The first witness is the man who encountered Mr. Cornell and was in apparent distress and fear. The witness told investigators he saw Cornell pull his shirt up and remove it. He saw Cornell wrap the shirt around his right hand and place both of his hands near his chest. The witness stated Cornell turned his back and faced away from him. The witness saw deputies running up the stairs to Cornell's location and heard one of the deputies yell for Cornell to get down. The witness said he was approximately 30 to 40 feet from Cornell when one of the deputies began shooting. The witness felt bullets going by him and saw them strike Cornell. The witness said Cornell was on his knees getting down to the ground when he was shot. A second witness observed the moments leading up to the shooting from a window on the side of a house. This witness heard screaming outside and looked out his door. He saw deputies looking towards the west. The witness moved to a window in the kitchen and looked out in the direction. He saw Mr. Cornell taking off his shirt and crouching or kneeling with his hands curled in fists in front of his chest, below his jaw. The witness did not see what Cornell did with his shirt, nor did he remember seeing the shirt on Cornell's hands. The witness headed back towards the door to tell the deputies where Cornell was. Before he reached the doorway, he heard gunshots. He did not witness the actual shooting as he was unable to see that area while moving from the window to his doorway as the shooting occurred. After a thorough review of the evidence, the district attorney's office has determined that the deputy's use of deadly force was reasonable under the circumstances. Several factors were considered. The deputies had recently received information on Mr. Cornell's outstanding felony warrant, his criminal history, his status as a suspect in 2 violent crimes, including the murder of a child, where he used a firearm in those incidents. Deputies were also advised to use caution because Cornell was considered armed and dangerous. Cornell was a member of the criminal street gang that threatened members of the sheriff's department, including the particular deputy involved, in retaliation for fellow gang members killed in prior officer-involved shootings. Specifically, there was a threat to the deputy involved in this incident and a threat to his family. There were posts on social media that indicated that harm was being encouraged and that Mr. Cornell expected to die. During the incident, Cornell fled from deputies and attempted to elude capture. When the first witness saw Cornell in this yard, Cornell signaled for him to be quiet as deputies approached. Cornell removed his shirt and wrapped it around his right hand, which could reasonably be interpreted as either an attempt to hide a handgun or as an attempt to simulate having a handgun. No handgun was recovered at the scene. In either scenario, Cornell did not want the deputies to be able to immediately recognize what, if anything, he held in his hands at the moment he drew towards them. When a deputy walked up the stairs to the upper level of the yard where the witness was hiding, he saw Cornell in a crouching position facing him, initially with his hands behind his back. Cornell quickly brought his hands forward, holding what appeared to the deputy as a handgun wrapped in a T-shirt. Under the totality of the circumstances, this action was reasonably interpreted by the deputy as an imminent threat that justified shooting in his own defense. The evidence indicates Cornell was shot while initially facing the deputy, followed by a series of shots along Cornell's body, consistent with Cornell rotating and moving as indicated by the deputy. According to the medical examiner's report, which corroborates the deputy's version, Cornell sustained gunshots in his legs, with a bullet trajectory entering the front of his leg and exiting to the back. The medical examiner's report also found Cornell had several gunshot wounds on his arm, consistent with Cornell's hands being raised and pointed towards the sheriff's deputy at the time of the shooting. Based on these circumstances and the law that controls the decision in this case, the deputy bears no criminal liability for his actions. The next incident is the fatal shooting of Bruce Dolly. On June 4, 2017, Mr. Dolly called 911 and said he was planning on shooting himself. 3 sheriff's deputies responded to Mr. Dolly's residence to investigate. Upon arrival, deputies heard a shot from within the residence. Mr. Dolly yelled at the deputies to leave and threatened to kill them. Dolly then shot at the deputies from his doorway and retreated back inside the house. Mr. Dolly returned to the doorway and attempted to shoot at the deputies again, but his pistol did not discharge. When he returned to the door a third time and pointed his pistol at the deputies, one of the deputies fired his shotgun almost simultaneously with another shot from Mr. Dolly. The single shotgun round fired struck Mr. Dolly in the abdomen. In this case, deputies were called to the scene by an individual who threatened to shoot himself while intoxicated and under the combined influence of alcohol and marijuana. Mr. Dolly's actions indicated he was intent on shooting any deputy that responded to his residence and or was intent on having deputies kill him. His pointing and firing his pistol at deputies caused deputies to realize that they were in danger of being killed or seriously injured. The sheriff's deputy's use of deadly force in this instance was reasonable, and he bears no criminal liability for his actions. The next incident is the fatal shooting of Mr. Isidro Bazan. Mr. Bazan burglarized a home. It was a hot prowl burglary of a home with an individual, the victim, inside. It was occupied by 4 residents in the early morning hours of March 2, 2017. The homeowner became aware of the intruder's presence and confronted the intruder, Mr. Bazan, who was armed with a baseball bat. Mr. Bazan told the homeowner to go back in his bedroom and not to call the sheriff's department, or Bazan would harm him. The homeowner locked himself in the bedroom and called the sheriff's department. Deputies responded to the residence and encountered Mr. Bazan in the kitchen. Bazan refused to cooperate with their commands and ran into the garage. He told deputies he had a handgun and made suicidal statements. He also threatened to shoot him. Bazan pointed what's known as a butane torchlighter at the deputies and then held it to the side of his head. The deputies could not tell what the item was, but were concerned it was a gun of some type. Bazan entered one of the 2 cars parked in the garage and tried to back it out. He could not reverse out of the garage because another car was parked behind him in the driveway. Bazan rammed the other car. Bazan got out of the car and began to run out of the garage. A deputy inside the house deployed a beanbag shotgun at Mr. Bazan. Another deputy was outside near the front of the garage and heard what he believed to be 2 gunshots. Almost simultaneously, the deputy saw Bazan with his arm extended towards the deputies. He believed Bazan had shot at the deputies in the house. The deputy could not see Mr. Bazan's hands as Bazan ran out of the garage. The deputy feared Bazan had shot at the other deputies as he was escaping. He feared Bazan would also shoot him, and he would pose a threat to citizens in the surrounding neighborhood. The deputy fired 2 rounds at Bazan, striking him once in the chest. Our review found that the deputy's use of deadly force was reasonable under the circumstances. Mr. Bazan had announced he had a Glock handgun in his possession. He had threatened to shoot the deputies and himself. He failed to follow commands and said he would not surrender. Mr. Bazan was in the process of a hot prowl residential burglary. Mr. Bazan appeared agitated, and his behavior of ramming the parked car in the driveway on multiple occasions demonstrated a desperate mindset. The deputy reasonably perceived that Mr. Bazan posed a risk to himself, other deputies at the scene, and the public, especially the surrounding neighborhood. As a result, the deputy does not bear any criminal liability for his actions because they were legally justified under the facts, the evidence, and the law. The final incident here today is the fatal shooting of Mr. Emmanuel Ibarra. On May 15, 2017, Mr. Ibarra stabbed the manager in the head with a knife at a fast food restaurant in Solano Beach. The manager had refused to provide water when Mr. Ibarra had returned to the store. Mr. Ibarra fled the scene and was found by 2 sheriff's deputies concealed behind a concrete wall under a railroad bridge. Mr. Ibarra was holding a knife in his hand. The deputies gave Mr. Ibarra multiple commands to relinquish the weapon, but he refused to comply. Mr. Ibarra charged towards the deputies, and one of the deputies fired his service weapon and struck Ibarra. Fire department personnel, along with paramedics, were called and rendered aid to Mr. Ibarra, who was transported via ambulance to the hospital where he died. In this case, the peace officers were confronted by Mr. Ibarra, who was armed with a knife. The deputies had received information that the subject had likely stabbed a person at a nearby restaurant. Mr. Ibarra charged at the deputies in a rapid manner with a knife, causing one deputy to trip and fall while retreating. Mr. Ibarra disregarded the deputy's commands to drop the knife. The deputy ultimately fired when he feared he and his colleagues would immediately be stabbed. Based on these circumstances, the DA's review finds that the deputy fired in his own defense and the defense of his fellow deputy. The deputy therefore bears no criminal liability for his actions. Like as I said at the end of this briefing, you can pick up the flash drive at the back of the room. It contains copies of the letters that have more detail about these incidents, and the letters have already been delivered to law enforcement. Are there any questions? Yes?
The deputy fired in his last one. Is he the one who tripped and fell, or the other deputy?
It's not the same deputy. The coroner indicates there were 15 shots. That seems to be the indication corroborating the deputy's information and report that he was moving and that he was pulling his hand rapidly from under his body, and that the deputy feared that he was going to continue to shoot at him. And so with that rotation movement, there's a lot of the back that's exposed as he rotated. As you know, the sheriff's department more recently deployed the body-worn cameras. At the time of these incidents in July of 2017, the deputies did not have body-worn camera. there were no videos whatsoever in these cases. The only potential video is in the incident where the gentleman was stabbed in the head at the store. There was video earlier at the store of that stabbing, but not associated with the shooting itself.
Just to cover the ground, no helicopter footage even.
There's no footage at all that I'm aware of, and we looked and asked for any footage that may be out there. That's my information. Well, thank you very much. This concludes the conference.